Zara's lavender skin trembled as she pressed herself against the cold metal wall of the transport ship. Around her, dozens of other young Corellian females sat in similar positions, their crystalline eyes reflecting the harsh overhead lights. The ship hummed with the sound of hyperspace engines, carrying them toward a fate none of them had chosen. The Galactic Council's newest decree had shattered the peace of 1,000 worlds. In their infinite wisdom, they had decided that interspecies bonding programs would strengthen the fragile alliance between member races. What they called cultural exchange, Zara knew was something far more sinister. The humans, those terrifying apex predators from the death world called Earth, would be selecting mates from among the eligible females of allied species. Zara had heard the stories. Every Corellian child grew up with tales of human brutality. They were a species that had crawled out of a world where everything tried to kill them, where massive predators roamed freely, and the very weather could end lives. Humans were the only known species to have achieved space travel while still engaging in planetary warfare. They were beings of violence and aggression, creatures who had turned the art of killing into a science. Her friend Lyra sat beside her, her normally bright blue skin now pale with fear. "What if they choose us?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the engine noise. "What if we're selected for their breeding programs?" Zara couldn't answer. The thought had been plaguing her mind since they'd been loaded onto the transport. The human military had specifically requested females from species known for their healing abilities and emotional sensitivity. Corellians, with their natural empathic powers and regenerative capabilities, were high on their list. The transport speakers crackled to life, and a mechanical voice announced their arrival at Nexus Station. Through the small viewport, Zara could see the massive space station growing larger. It was a testament to human engineering, all sharp angles and intimidating weaponry. Even their architecture looked aggressive. As they disembarked, Zara noticed the human guards immediately. They were enormous, easily twice the height of any Corellian, with thick muscles and skin that looked like it could turn blades. Their faces were hidden behind dark helmets, making them appear even more menacing. One of them gestured toward a corridor with movements that seemed barely controlled, as if violence was always just beneath the surface. The processing center was sterile and frightening. Human technicians in white coats moved between stations, scanning each alien female with devices that hummed and beeped. When it was Zara's turn, she closed her eyes and tried to make herself as small as possible. The scanner's red light passed over her body, recording everything from her bone density to her genetic markers. "Excellent specimen," one technician muttered to another, making notes on a data pad. "High empathic rating, superior healing factor, optimal reproductive indicators." Zara felt sick. They were talking about her like she was livestock being evaluated for auction. The casual way they discussed her body, her abilities, her potential usefulness made her feel smaller than she'd ever felt in her life. After processing, the females were herded into a large waiting area. The walls were lined with screens displaying information about human culture, but Zara couldn't focus on the cheerful propaganda videos. All she could think about were the stories she'd heard about human mating rituals, about their aggressive territorial behavior, about their tendency to claim ownership over anything they considered valuable. Hours passed before the first selection began. A massive human male entered the waiting area, his black uniform covered in medals and insignia that meant nothing to Zara, but clearly indicated high rank. His face was scarred, with cold gray eyes that seemed to look right through the assembled females. When he spoke, his voice was deep and commanding. "I am Colonel Harrison of the Earth Defense Force," he announced. "Today begins the selection process for the Human-Alien Integration Program. Each of you has been chosen for your species' unique qualities and potential compatibility with human partners." He began walking among them, occasionally stopping to examine one female or another more closely. When he paused in front of Zara, she could smell something metallic and dangerous about him, like weapons and old blood. His eyes scanned her from head to toe, and she felt exposed despite being fully clothed. "This one shows promise," he said to an aide, who made a mark on his tablet. "Schedule her for compatibility testing with the Special Forces candidates." Zara's blood turned to ice. Special Forces meant the most elite, most dangerous human warriors. These were the soldiers who had ended the rebellion on Gamma Prime in a single day, who had cleared an entire moon of hostile aliens using nothing but small arms and determination. If she was chosen by one of them, she would be claimed by a creature whose entire existence revolved around death and destruction. As the colonel moved on, Lyra reached over and squeezed Zara's hand. Her friend's skin was cold and clammy with fear. Around them, other females wept quietly as they too were marked for testing with various human military units. The selection process continued for what felt like hours. Some females were dismissed entirely, told they weren't suitable for the program and would be returned to their home worlds. Zara almost envied them. Others were grouped together based on their assigned compatibility ratings with different branches of human military service. By the end of the day, Zara found herself in a group of 12 females, all marked for testing with Special Forces units. They were led to a different section of the station, one that felt even more militaristic and threatening. The corridors here were narrower, designed for quick movement and defensive positions. Everything was built for war. Their new quarters were sparse but functional. Each female had a small room with a bed, a desk, and a communication terminal. The walls were thick enough that Zara couldn't hear anything from neighboring rooms, which somehow made the isolation feel even more complete. That night, as she lay on the unfamiliar bed staring at the metal ceiling, Zara tried to imagine what her life would become. Would she be treated as a pet, a prize, a tool to be used and discarded when her usefulness ended? The humans she'd seen so far had shown no warmth, no kindness, no indication that they viewed her as anything more than a resource to be allocated. Sleep came fitfully, filled with nightmares of gray eyes and scarred faces, of being claimed by a monster who would never see her as anything more than a useful alien to be possessed and controlled. The next morning brought new horrors. Zara and the other selected females were awakened before dawn by harsh alarms and barked orders from human guards. They were given strange-tasting nutrition bars and led to what the humans called evaluation chambers. The very name made Zara's stomach churn with anxiety. The chambers were sterile, white rooms filled with medical equipment and monitoring devices. Human doctors and scientists moved between them with clinical efficiency, treating the alien females like experimental subjects rather than sentient beings. Zara found herself strapped to a table while sensors were attached to her skin and probes measured her responses to various stimuli. Subject exhibits heightened stress responses, one doctor noted as Zara's empathic abilities went haywire in the presence of so much cold analytical thinking. Recommend mild sedation for future testing phases. They tested everything. Her strength, her healing abilities, her empathic range, even her capacity for pain tolerance. Each test felt like a violation, a systematic cataloging of her worth as a potential mate for human warriors. The worst part was how matter-of-fact the humans were about it all. They showed no recognition that she was a person with feelings and fears. During one particularly invasive scan, Zara overheard two technicians discussing her results. The empathic rating is off the charts, one said. A soldier bonded to her would have incredible tactical advantages. She could sense enemy emotions, predict their actions, even influence their mental states during combat. Perfect for psychological warfare applications, the other agreed. No wonder the Special Forces units are interested in these Corellians. Zara realized with growing horror that they weren't just looking for mates. They wanted living weapons, beings whose natural abilities could be exploited for military purposes. She would become a tool of war, used to make human soldiers even more deadly than they already were. After the medical evaluations came psychological testing. Zara was placed in a room with a human psychologist, a stern-faced woman with calculating eyes who asked questions designed to map her mental vulnerabilities and emotional triggers. The psychologist showed her images of human soldiers in combat, watching carefully for Zara's reactions. "How do you feel about violence?" the woman asked, making notes as Zara visibly recoiled from photos of battlefield destruction. "I hate it," Zara answered honestly. "My people are healers. We believe in peace and harmony." "Interesting," the psychologist murmured. "Your file indicates you have trauma responses to aggressive displays. This could be useful for conditioning protocols." Conditioning. The word made Zara's blood run cold. They weren't just planning to assign her to a human soldier. They intended to modify her psychologically to make her more compliant and useful. She would be broken down and rebuilt to serve their purposes. The days blended together in a nightmare of tests and evaluations. Zara learned that she wasn't alone in her fear. During brief moments when the females were allowed to interact, she heard similar stories from the others. All of them were being evaluated for specific military applications of their natural abilities. Lyra had been selected for her species' natural toxin resistance, making her valuable for soldiers who operated in hazardous environments. Another female, from the aquatic Delphi race, was being considered for underwater special operations units. Each of them was being measured not for compatibility as a partner, but for their utility as living equipment. The human soldiers they occasionally glimpsed in the corridors only reinforced their fears. These were not the diplomats or scientists that appeared in the propaganda videos. These were killers, bred and trained for destruction. Their movements were predatory, their eyes constantly scanning for threats. Even when they weren't actively fighting, they carried themselves like weapons waiting to be deployed. One evening, as Zara sat alone in her quarters, she overheard a conversation between two guards in the hallway. They were discussing the selection process with casual brutality that made her sick. "The brass wants the most responsive specimens paired with the Omega units," one guard said. "Those guys need partners who can handle the psychological stress of deep cover assassination missions. What about the ones who break during conditioning?" The other asked. "Standard protocol, memory wipe and reassignment to civilian auxiliary roles. They won't remember being selected in the first place." Zara pressed her face against the cold wall and tried not to sob. Even if she couldn't adapt to whatever they wanted to turn her into, she would lose herself completely. Her memories, her personality, everything that made her who she was would be stripped away and replaced with artificial compliance. The next phase of evaluation was the most terrifying yet. They called it compatibility assessment, but Zara quickly realized it was actually a form of psychological conditioning. Each female was paired with a holographic projection of a human soldier and forced to interact with the simulation for hours at a time. Zara's assigned simulation was of a massive human male in black combat armor. His face was hidden behind a tactical mask, but she could see cold blue eyes staring at her through the visor. The hologram spoke in a deep, commanding voice that made her instinctively want to hide. "You are now assigned to operative designation Echo 7, the projection announced. "Your primary function is tactical support and mission enhancement. Compliance is mandatory." The simulation forced her through various scenarios, each designed to break down her natural resistance to violence and authority. She was shown combat footage and ordered to provide empathic analysis of enemy soldiers. When she refused or hesitated, the room filled with piercing alarms and flashing lights that triggered her species' natural stress responses. After each session, Zara felt a little more of herself slipping away. The constant pressure to comply, to accept her role as a tool of human warfare, was wearing down her mental defenses. She could see the same thing happening to the other females. Their eyes were becoming duller, their movements more mechanical. But worse than the conditioning was the growing certainty that somewhere in the station, real human soldiers were watching these sessions and deciding which of them would be selected. She imagined cold, calculating eyes evaluating her responses, determining whether she would be useful enough to claim. The thought of being chosen by one of these human predators filled her with a terror that went beyond mere fear. These were beings who had turned killing into an art form, who viewed everything around them as either a resource to be exploited or an obstacle to be eliminated. What would happen to her gentle, empathic nature when it was twisted to serve such creatures? As she lay in her narrow bunk that night, Zara made a desperate decision. She would find a way to fail the remaining evaluations. Better to face memory wipe and reassignment than to become a living weapon in the hands of a human monster. She would rather lose herself entirely than become something that helped these creatures spread more death and destruction across the galaxy. Tomorrow would bring new tests, new attempts to break her spirit and reshape her into something useful for human warfare. But tonight, she held on to the last fragments of who she was and promised herself that she would resist them for as long as possible. Zara's plan to fail the evaluations proved harder than she'd imagined. The human testing protocols were designed to account for resistance, and her attempts at non-compliance only triggered more intensive conditioning sessions. Every time she refused to cooperate, the psychological pressure increased. Sleep deprivation, sensory overload, and isolation techniques that her species found particularly devastating. 3 days into her resistance, Zara found herself strapped to a chair in a room filled with speakers that blasted discordant sounds designed to disrupt Corellian neural patterns. Her empathic abilities, normally a source of strength, became a weakness as the humans flooded her senses with artificial emotional chaos. Dr. Chen, the lead psychologist, stood before her with a data pad, completely unmoved by Zara's obvious distress. Subject continues to resist integration protocols, she noted aloud. Recommend escalation to Phase 3 conditioning. Please, Zara whispered, her voice hoarse from screaming. I just want to go home. Home is no longer relevant to your existence, Dr. Chen replied coldly. You are now property of the Earth Defense Force. Your previous life has been terminated. The sooner you accept this reality, the easier your transition will be. Property. The word hit Zara like a physical blow. In their minds, she had already ceased to be a person. She was just another piece of military equipment to be calibrated and deployed. The Phase 3 conditioning was unlike anything she'd experienced. They used her empathic abilities against her, forcing her to experience the memories and emotions of human soldiers in combat. Through some kind of neural interface, she felt their adrenaline-fueled bloodlust, their satisfaction at eliminating enemies, their cold calculation in the face of death. The worst part was that some of the memories felt almost addictive. There was something intoxicating about the absolute focus of combat, the clarity that came with life-or-death decisions. Part of her began to understand why humans were so effective at warfare. They turned killing into a form of meditation, a perfect unity of mind and body in service of destruction. But she also experienced their pain. The grief of losing comrades, the weight of taking lives, the psychological scars that even the strongest human warriors carried. She felt their loneliness, their desperate need for connection in a universe that seemed determined to isolate them through their own effectiveness at violence. It was during one of these forced memory sessions that Zara first encountered him. She was experiencing the memories of a human sniper, when suddenly the perspective shifted. Instead of looking through the scope at a target, she was looking at the sniper himself through someone else's eyes. He was tall even by human standards, with dark hair and intense green eyes that seemed to hold depths of sadness and determination. His face was scarred, but not in the crude way she'd expected. The marks looked almost artistic, like carefully placed lines that enhanced rather than disfigured his features. What shocked her most was the gentleness in his movements, as he tended to wounded civilians after a firefight. His large hands, designed for destruction, moved with surprising delicacy as he applied medical supplies to injured aliens. When a Karelian child cried in fear at his approach, he knelt down and spoke in perfect Karelian, his voice soft and reassuring. "It's okay, little one," he said in her native language. "I'm here to help." The memory ended abruptly, leaving Zara confused and shaken. This didn't match anything she'd been told about human soldiers. The propaganda had painted them as mindless killers, but this warrior showed compassion and intelligence that challenged everything she thought she knew. Over the following days, more fragments of his memories leaked through during her conditioning sessions. She learned his designation, Sergeant Marcus Reynolds, Special Operations. She saw him reading poetry between missions, studying alien cultures with genuine fascination, protecting non-combatants even when it put his own life at risk. But she also witnessed his effectiveness in combat. He moved through enemy positions like death itself, silent and inexorable. His marksmanship was legendary among human forces. He could eliminate targets at impossible distances, often without the enemy ever knowing he was there. Yet after each mission, she felt his emotional weight, the careful accounting he kept of every life he'd taken. The contradiction fascinated and terrified her. How could someone be both a perfect killer and a gentle protector? How could the same hands that delivered death with surgical precision also comfort frightened children? Dr. Chen noticed her responses to these particular memory fragments. "Interesting," she murmured during one monitoring session. "Subject shows elevated neural activity during exposure to Operative Reynolds' psychological profile. This could indicate optimal compatibility parameters." Zara's blood turned to ice. They weren't just showing her random memories for conditioning purposes. They were testing her reactions to specific soldiers, looking for psychological compatibility markers. Her fascination with Marcus Reynolds had marked her as a potential match for him. That night, alone in her cell, Zara tried to process what she'd learned. The human they were considering pairing her with wasn't the mindless brute she'd expected. He was complex, intelligent, and capable of surprising gentleness. But he was also one of the most dangerous individuals in the human military. a specialist in elimination and infiltration whose very existence revolved around death. She found herself thinking about the poetry he read. What kind of warrior found comfort in verse? What did it say about him that he took time to learn alien languages not for tactical advantages, but to offer comfort to those caught in the crossfire of wars they didn't understand? The more she thought about Marcus Reynolds, the more confused she became. Her fear remained, but it was now mixed with something else. Curiosity, perhaps, or maybe recognition of a kindred spirit trapped in circumstances beyond his control, just as she was. 2 days later, the announcement came. Dr. Chen entered her cell with a satisfied expression and a tablet full of official documents. "Congratulations. Subject 247, she said with false cheer. "You've been selected for permanent assignment to Special Operations Sergeant Marcus Reynolds. The pairing ceremony will take place tomorrow." Zara's world collapsed around her. Despite everything she'd tried to do, despite her resistance and her attempts to fail their tests, she had been chosen. Tomorrow she would be handed over to a human killer, her life and freedom sacrificed to serve his military effectiveness. But as she sat in the darkness of her cell, one thought kept recurring. In all the memories she'd experienced, Marcus Reynolds had never once treated alien beings as objects or tools. Even in the heat of combat, he had shown them a respect that his own superiors rarely displayed. Maybe, just maybe, her fate wouldn't be as terrible as she'd imagined. Or maybe that hope was just another form of conditioning, designed to make her more compliant when the moment of truth arrived. Either way, tomorrow would bring answers to questions she'd never wanted to ask. The pairing ceremony was held in a sterile conference room that felt more like a business transaction than any kind of meaningful ritual. Zara sat at one end of a metal table, her hands shaking despite her best efforts to appear calm. Across from her, various human officials shuffled papers and spoke in hushed tones about logistics and operational parameters. She wore a simple white dress that the humans had provided, claiming it was traditional for such ceremonies. Everything about the situation felt artificial and wrong, as if they were trying to put a civilized veneer on what was essentially a transfer of ownership. The door opened, and Dr. Chen entered with a satisfied smile. "Excellent news," she announced. "Sergeant Reynolds has arrived and completed his briefing on your capabilities and operational integration protocols. He'll be joining us momentarily." Zara's heart raced. After days of experiencing his memories and emotions through the conditioning process, she felt like she knew him intimately. But those glimpses had been filtered through military psychological profiles and carefully selected fragments. What would he be like in person? Would he see her as the weapon his superiors wanted her to become? Or would there be some trace of the gentleness she'd witnessed in those stolen moments? Heavy footsteps echoed in the corridor outside, and Zara forced herself to breathe slowly. She had survived the conditioning, the evaluations, and the psychological breaking attempts. She could survive this too, whatever it brought. The door opened again, and Marcus Reynolds entered the room. He was even larger in person than she'd expected. Easily 7 feet tall with the characteristic broad shoulders and muscled build of human special forces. His dark hair was shorter than in the memories she'd experienced, cropped close in military fashion. The scars on his face were more pronounced under the harsh fluorescent lights, creating a map of old wounds across skin that looked like weathered leather. But it was his eyes that caught her attention. Those same intense green eyes from the memories, but they held something she hadn't expected to see. Uncertainty, maybe even discomfort with the entire situation. "Sergeant Reynolds," Dr. Chen said briskly, "please meet your assigned partner. Subject 247. She has been conditioned to provide optimal tactical support for your mission parameters." Marcus looked directly at Zara for the first time, and she felt a jolt of recognition, not from the memories but something deeper. His empathic signature was unlike any human she'd encountered during her time on the station. Where the others projected coldness, calculation, or barely contained aggression, he radiated something more complex, sadness perhaps, resignation, and underneath it all a carefully guarded warmth that he seemed determined to hide. "Does she have a name?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying the same gentle tone she'd heard in the memory with the frightened child. Dr. Chen looked surprised by the question. "Designations are more efficient for operational purposes. Subject 247 has been optimized for..." "She's a person, not a piece of equipment," Marcus interrupted, his tone hardening. If we're going to work together, I'd like to know what to call her. The room fell silent. Even the other officials stopped their paperwork to stare at the insubordinate soldier. Zara realized that she was witnessing something unprecedented, a human warrior challenging the system that had created this entire situation. "My name is Zara," she said quietly. Speaking for the first time since entering the room, her voice sounded strange after days of enforced silence during conditioning. Marcus nodded respectfully. "It's nice to meet you, Zara. I'm Marcus." He glanced around the room at the assembled officials with obvious distaste. "I'm sorry about all of this. The circumstances aren't exactly ideal." Dr. Chen cleared her throat impatiently. "If we could proceed with the ceremony, Sergeant. The integration process needs to begin immediately, if you're to be combat ready for your next assignment." Marcus turned to face the psychologist, and Zara saw something dangerous flash in his eyes. "There won't be any integration process, Doctor. At least not the kind you're thinking of." "I don't understand," Dr. Chen replied, consulting her tablet. "The subject has been conditioned to provide tactical empathic support. Her neural pathways have been modified to turn her into a living weapon," Marcus finished. "I've read the reports. I know what you people have done to her." He looked back at Zara and she saw genuine anger in his expression, not directed at her, but at the system that had brought them both to this moment. "What they've done to all of you." The room erupted in protests from the officials. They spoke over each other, citing military regulations, operational necessity, and the importance of the alien integration program. Marcus listened to their arguments with growing impatience before finally holding up one massive hand for silence. "Let me make something clear," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that made even high-ranking officers pay attention. "I didn't volunteer for this program. I was assigned to it after refusing a direct order to eliminate non-combatant civilians during the Vega incident. This was supposed to be my punishment." Zara felt her world shift slightly. Marcus hadn't chosen to be here any more than she had. He was being punished for showing mercy, for refusing to become the mindless killer that his superiors wanted. "However," Marcus continued, "now that I'm here, we're going to do things differently. Zara's going to be my partner, not my tool. She'll work with me because she chooses to, not because she's been psychologically conditioned to comply." Dr. Chen looked appalled. "That's completely contrary to the integration protocols. The subjects have been specifically modified to provide optimal support without the complications of independent decision-making." "Then you'll have to unmodify her," Marcus said flatly, "because I don't work with slaves." The argument that followed was unlike anything Zara had ever witnessed. Marcus, despite being outnumbered and technically outranked by some of the officials present, held his ground with unwavering determination. He quoted military regulations about the treatment of sentient beings, referenced previous court cases involving alien rights, and made it clear that he would rather face court-martial than participate in what he called institutionalized slavery. Through it all, Zara sat in stunned silence. No one had ever fought for her before. Even among her own people, she had been considered expendable enough to be included in the selection pool. But this human warrior, this supposed monster that she'd been taught to fear, was willing to risk his career to protect her dignity. Finally, after nearly an hour of heated discussion, Dr. Chen threw up her hands in frustration. "Fine," she snapped. "But if this experiment fails, if Subject 247 proves unable to function without conditioning protocols, the responsibility is entirely yours, Sergeant." "Her name is Zara," Marcus reminded her. "And yes, I'll take full responsibility." The ceremony that followed was brief and perfunctory. Papers were signed, assignments were confirmed, and Zara found herself officially assigned to Marcus Reynolds for an indefinite period. But the real moment of truth came when the officials finally left them alone in the conference room. Marcus pulled out a chair across from her and sat down, moving carefully as if he was afraid of frightening her. "I imagine you have questions," he said gently, "and probably some concerns about what happens next." Zara stared at him, still trying to process everything that had just occurred. "Why?" she whispered. "Why did you do that?" "Because it was the right thing to do," Marcus replied simply. "Because you deserve better than being treated like a piece of equipment. And because if we're going to work together, it needs to be based on mutual respect, not coercion." For the first time since her capture, Zara felt something other than fear or despair. It was a small feeling, fragile and uncertain, but unmistakably real. Hope. The quarters Marcus brought her to were nothing like the sterile cells she'd grown accustomed to. Located in a different section of the station entirely, they felt more like an actual living space than a containment facility. The main room had comfortable seating, books scattered on tables, and windows that looked out at the stars instead of blank metal walls. The couch pulls out into a bed, Marcus explained, setting down the small bag of personal items the station had returned to her. The bedroom is mine, but if you'd prefer privacy, I can take the couch. Zara looked around the space in amazement. After weeks of imprisonment, the simple luxury of choosing where to sit felt overwhelming. This is where you live? When I'm stationed here, yes. It's not much, but it's better than the standard quarters they assign to most soldiers. Marcus moved to a small kitchen area and began preparing something that smelled like tea. Are you hungry? The station food isn't great, but I've got some things that might be more familiar to your palate. The casual domesticity of the moment felt surreal after everything she'd experienced. Marcus moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, his movements careful and controlled. She could see the weapons training in how he positioned himself, always aware of exits and potential threats. But there was also something genuinely peaceful about watching him perform such mundane tasks. You don't have to take care of me, Zara said quietly. I know this wasn't your choice either. Marcus paused in his tea preparation and looked at her seriously. No, it wasn't my choice. But that doesn't mean I'm going to make the best of a bad situation by treating you badly. He resumed his work, measuring herbs into a strainer. I've read your file, Zara. Not the military assessment, but your actual background. You were a healer on your homeworld. You ran a clinic for children. The mention of her old life hit Zara like a physical blow. She hadn't thought about the clinic in weeks, focusing instead on survival and fear. But now the memories came flooding back. The small faces that had looked up at her with trust and hope. The satisfaction of mending broken bones and healing infections, the simple joy of making others feel better. They told me that life was over, she whispered, that I was property now. They lied. Marcus brought her a steaming cup of tea and she recognized the scent immediately. Kellara root, a traditional Karelian calming herb. The fact that he'd gone to the trouble of acquiring it, of learning what would comfort her, said more than any words could. You're still who you've always been, Zara. Nothing they did to you changes that. She took a sip of the tea and felt some of the tension leave her body. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't afraid of the human sitting across from her. Marcus radiated a calm strength that had nothing to do with violence or dominance. He simply felt safe. What happens now? She asked. They said we'd be assigned missions together. Marcus nodded grimly. That part is true. The military expects us to function as an integrated unit. They want to use your empathic abilities to give me tactical advantages in the field. He leaned forward, his expression serious. But here's what they don't understand. I don't need those advantages. I've been doing this job for 15 years without empathic support. I'm good at what I do because I understand people, not because I can sense their emotions. Then why accept the assignment? Because saying no would have meant you'd be assigned to someone else. Someone who might not care about treating you like a person. Marcus's jaw tightened. I've seen how some of the other soldiers treat their assigned partners. It's not pretty. Zara felt a chill run down her spine. She'd been so focused on her own situation that she hadn't thought much about the other females who'd been selected. What about my friends? Lyra and the others? Marcus's expression darkened further. Some are doing better than others. The soldier who was assigned your friend Lyra is less enlightened than I am. But there are regulations about treatment of alien partners, and I'm making sure those regulations are enforced. The idea that Marcus was protecting not just her but other vulnerable aliens made Zara see him in a new light. He wasn't just being kind to her out of personal preference. He had a moral code that extended to anyone who couldn't protect themselves. Over the next few days, Zara began to understand what life with Marcus would actually be like. He maintained a routine that was disciplined but not oppressive. Morning physical training, which he invited her to join but didn't insist on. Afternoon mission planning and equipment maintenance. Evenings spent reading, studying, or simply talking. The talking was what surprised her most. Marcus was genuinely curious about Karelian culture, about her experiences as a healer, about the philosophical differences between their species. He shared his own stories as well, speaking about his childhood on Earth, his reasons for joining the military, and his growing disillusionment with the methods his superiors expected him to use. I became a soldier to protect people, he told her one evening as they sat watching ships dock at the station through the window. But somewhere along the way, the definition of people got narrower and narrower. Now it seems like anyone who isn't human isn't worth protecting. Is that why you refused the order on Vega? Zara asked. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. There were children in that settlement. Families who'd done nothing wrong except be in the wrong place when a war started. My commanding officer ordered me to eliminate all potential security risks. His hands clenched into fists. I couldn't do it. I wouldn't do it. Zara reached out instinctively and placed her small hand over one of his. The touch was electric, sending waves of his emotional state through her empathic senses. She felt his pain, his anger at an unjust system, his determination to do what was right regardless of consequences. But underneath it all, she sensed something else, a deep loneliness that he carried like a weight. You did the right thing, she said softly. Did I? My refusal meant they assigned someone else to the mission, someone who didn't hesitate to follow orders. Marcus looked at their joined hands with an expression she couldn't quite read. Those children died anyway, and I ended up here as punishment for my conscience. But you maintained your honor, Zara insisted. You stayed true to who you are. And what good did that do? It brought you to me, she said before she could stop herself. The words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither was quite ready to address. Marcus looked at her with surprise, then something that might have been gratitude. You're not what I expected, Zara. What did you expect? Someone broken. Someone who'd been turned into a tool by the conditioning process. Someone who'd hate me for what my species did to her. Marcus's voice was soft, almost vulnerable. I didn't expect someone who could still show compassion to her captor. You're not my captor, Zara said firmly. You're the first person who's treated me like I matter since this whole nightmare began. They sat in comfortable silence after that, watching the stars wheel slowly past the window. For the first time since her selection, Zara felt something approaching peace. She was still trapped in an impossible situation, still assigned to a human soldier for purposes she didn't fully understand. But Marcus wasn't the monster she'd been taught to fear. He was something far more dangerous to her carefully maintained emotional defenses. He was a good man trying to do right in an impossible situation. And despite everything she'd been through, despite all her fears and conditioning, Zara found herself beginning to care about what happened to him. Their first mission assignment came 2 weeks later. Marcus had been doing his best to shield Zara from the realities of what their partnership would eventually require, but the sealed orders that arrived made it clear that their brief respite was over. Reconnaissance and elimination on Kepler Form 42b, Marcus read from the mission briefing, his expression growing darker with each line. Intelligence suggests a separatist cell is using the mining colony as a base for anti-human terrorist activities. Zara felt her stomach clench. My people? Unknown. The briefing doesn't specify species, but Kepler 442b has a significant Corellian population. Marcus set down the datapad and looked at her with concern. This is exactly what I was afraid of. They're sending us somewhere they think your empathic abilities will be most useful, but also most painful. The thought of being forced to help hunt her own people made Zara feel sick, but as she watched Marcus struggle with the same moral dilemma, she realized something important. They were both trapped by circumstances beyond their control, but they didn't have to let those circumstances define who they became. What if we did things differently? She asked quietly. What do you mean? The mission orders say reconnaissance and elimination. But what if the reconnaissance reveals that the separatists aren't actually terrorists? What if they're just people trying to protect their families from human expansion? Marcus studied her face carefully. That would be a very convenient discovery. It would also be career suicide for me to report findings that contradict intelligence assumptions. But it would be the truth, Zara insisted, and you told me that truth matters to you more than career advancement. A slow smile spread across Marcus's face. You're suggesting we conduct an honest investigation instead of a predetermined manhunt. I'm suggesting we do what's right, regardless of what our orders expect us to find. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications. Finally, he nodded. All right, But you need to understand what this means. If we're discovered, if Command realizes we're not following the intended mission parameters, we'll both be considered traitors. What's the alternative? Following orders that might make us complicit in atrocities? No, Marcus said firmly. There's no alternative. We do this right or we don't do it at all. The journey to Kepler 442b gave them time to plan their approach. Marcus's official mission was to infiltrate the separatist cell and eliminate key leadership figures. Zara's role was to use her empathic abilities to identify targets and assess their threat levels. But what they actually planned was a careful investigation into the colony's situation, using Zara's natural healing abilities and cultural knowledge to gain the trust of the local population. The mining operation has been expanding aggressively, Marcus explained as they studied satellite images of the colony. The original Corellian settlement was established with proper environmental protections, but the Human Mining Consortium has been ignoring those agreements. Zara looked at the images with growing alarm. What had once been a carefully planned community in harmony with the planet's ecosystem now looked like a scar across the landscape. Strip mines had been carved into sacred groves, and the crystal-clear streams she remembered from similar colonies were now muddy with runoff. "They're destroying everything," she whispered. "No wonder there's resistance." "The question is whether that resistance has turned violent," Marcus said. "If they're actually planning terrorist attacks, we'll have to find a way to stop them without becoming executioners. But if they're just trying to protect their homes, then we protect them too," Zara finished. They landed at the colony under cover of darkness, Marcus's special operations training making their infiltration invisible to both the mining consortium's security and any potential separatist watchers. The colony was larger than Zara had expected, with several thousand residents living in traditional Corellian biodomes alongside hastily constructed human industrial facilities. The contrast was jarring. Where Corellian architecture flowed organically with the landscape, the human buildings squatted like geometric tumors on the planet's surface. The air itself felt wrong, tainted with chemical smells that made Zara's sensitive respiratory system burn. Their first contact with the local population came when they encountered a group of Corellian children playing near one of the polluted streams. The youngsters scattered in fear when they saw Marcus, but Zara called out to them in their native language, her healer's training automatically assessing their health status. "Wait," she said gently. "I can help with that cough." One of the children, a little girl no more than 6 years old, was struggling with the same respiratory distress that Zara had felt upon arrival. The child's mother emerged from the nearby biodome, her expression wary but desperate. "You're not with the mining consortium," the woman said, noting Zara's traditional healer's markings. "No," Zara replied, kneeling beside the sick child. "I'm a healer." "Your daughter is reacting to the atmospheric pollutants. I can help if you'll let me." As Zara worked, using her natural abilities to ease the child's breathing, Marcus kept watch. But Zara could sense his emotional state through their growing empathic connection. He was horrified by what they were seeing. The mining operation wasn't just environmentally destructive. It was slowly poisoning the indigenous population. Word of Zara's healing abilities spread quickly through the colony. Soon they had a steady stream of visitors, all suffering from ailments directly related to the mining operation's environmental impact: respiratory problems, skin conditions, neurological symptoms from heavy metal exposure. The Human Mining Consortium had medical facilities, but they were for their own personnel only. "This is genocide," Marcus said quietly as they worked late into the night treating patients. "Maybe not intentional, but it's systematic destruction of the indigenous population." "The resistance movements," Zara said, realizing the truth. "They're not terrorists. They're people trying to save their own lives." Their investigation over the following days confirmed their worst fears. The separatist cell that intelligence had identified was actually a group of parents and community leaders trying to document the environmental damage and petition for legal protection. Their communications had been intercepted and misinterpreted as terrorist planning. The weapons stockpiles that had triggered the mission were actually medical supplies and air filtration equipment that the Corellians had been importing to protect their families. The training facilities were workshops where they built water purification systems and atmospheric processors. Marcus compiled a detailed report of their findings, complete with environmental readings, medical documentation of the poisoning effects, and evidence that the mining consortium had been deliberately suppressing information about the health impacts of their operations. "This changes everything," he told Zara as he prepared to transmit the report to command. "They can't order us to eliminate people who are defending themselves against corporate-sponsored genocide." But when the response came back, it was not what either of them had hoped for. "Mission parameters unchanged," the message read. "Elimination of separatist leadership remains priority. Environmental concerns are outside mission scope." Marcus stared at the screen in disbelief. They don't care. Even with proof that these people are innocent, Command still wants them dead. Zara felt a cold certainty settle in her chest. They never cared about justice or truth. They just want to clear the way for more mining operations. "Then we're not just facing a moral choice anymore," Marcus said grimly. "We're facing a direct order to commit murder in service of corporate interests. What do we do?" Marcus looked at her with an expression that mixed determination with sadness. "We do what's right, and we accept the consequences." That night, as they prepared for what they both knew would be their final mission as official partners, Zara realized that somewhere along the way, her fears about being chosen by a human soldier had been completely wrong. She hadn't been chosen by a monster. She'd been chosen by someone who would rather sacrifice his career, his freedom, and his life than compromise his principles. And despite everything that had brought them together, despite all the reasons she should hate him and his species, Zara knew that she was falling in love with Marcus Reynolds. The plan they developed was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Instead of eliminating the separatist leaders, Marcus would help them escape off-world while making it appear that the cell had been neutralized. Zara would use her healing abilities to treat the most critically ill colonists, preparing them for evacuation if necessary, but first they had to deal with the mining consortium's security forces, who had grown suspicious of their extended stay in the colony. 2 more days, Marcus said, as they prepared their equipment for what would officially be their final sweep of the area. "The transport ship I contacted will be here in 2 days. We just need to keep up appearances until then." Zara nodded, checking her medical supplies one more time. She'd been working around the clock to stabilize the sickest colonists, pushing her healing abilities to their absolute limits. The effort was exhausting, but seeing children breathe freely again made every moment of fatigue worthwhile. "Marcus," she said quietly, not looking up from her work. "When this is over, when they court-martial you for disobeying orders, what will happen to me?" Marcus paused in his weapon maintenance. "I don't know. Probably reassignment to another soldier. Maybe memory reconditioning if they think you've been compromised by our partnership." The thought of losing her memories, of forgetting everything she'd learned and felt over the past weeks, made Zara's hands shake. "I don't want to forget you," she whispered. "Zara." Marcus set down his rifle and moved to sit beside her. "There's something I need to tell you before we do this. Something I should have said days ago." She looked up at him, noting the vulnerability in his expression. "What is it?" "This partnership, this mission, everything we've done together. It's changed me. You've changed me." Marcus reached out and gently touched her face, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle against her lavender skin. "I know the circumstances that brought us together were terrible. I know you had no choice in being assigned to me. But working with you, seeing your compassion and courage, it's made me remember why I became a soldier in the first place." Zara leaned into his touch, her empathic abilities flooding her with the depth of his emotions. Love, yes, but also respect, admiration, and a profound gratitude that she'd helped him find his moral center again. "I love you too," she said simply. "I know I shouldn't. I know it's probably just trauma bonding or conditioning effects. But what I feel for you is real, regardless of how it started." Marcus pulled her close, and for a moment they sat in peaceful silence, drawing strength from each other before the chaos that was about to begin. The mining consortium's attack came at dawn, just as Marcus had predicted. Security forces surrounded the biodome where the separatist leaders were meeting, intending to capture them for interrogation, but Marcus and Zara were ready. Marcus moved through the security perimeter like a ghost, his special operations training making him effectively invisible to the corporate soldiers. One by one, he disabled their communications equipment and neutralized their heavy weapons, creating confusion and disarray in their ranks. Meanwhile, Zara worked with the separatist leaders to evacuate the most vulnerable colonists. Her healing abilities proved invaluable in stabilizing injured civilians and helping them reach the hidden transport sites that Marcus had established around the colony. The fighting was brief but intense. When the security forces realized they were facing a trained military operative rather than desperate civilians, they called for reinforcements from the mining platform in orbit. But Marcus had anticipated this as well, having already sabotaged their communication arrays and disabled their shuttle bays. "Transport ship is on approach," Marcus reported through their comm link as he held off a squad of security forces at the colony's main entrance. "Evacuation is proceeding on schedule." Zara felt a surge of pride and terror as she watched him work. He was magnificent in combat, moving with deadly precision and split-second timing, but she could also sense the emotional cost of each life he was forced to take. The careful accounting he kept of every soul added to his already heavy burden. The evacuation went better than they dared hope. Nearly 200 colonists made it onto the transport ship, including all of the separatist leaders and the most critically ill children. As the ship lifted off toward hyperspace, Zara felt a moment of pure triumph. They'd done it. They'd saved innocent lives and prevented an atrocity, but their victory was short-lived. As they watched the transport disappear into the night sky, Marcus's comm unit crackled to life with an incoming transmission from orbit. "Sergeant Reynolds," came the cold voice of Colonel Harrison, the officer who had overseen Zara's original selection process. "You have 30 seconds to explain why my sensors show a civilian transport leaving the planet when your mission report indicated all separatist leadership was eliminated." Marcus looked at Zara, his expression grim but determined. "Truth time," he said, then activated his comm unit. "Because they weren't separatists, Colonel. They were families trying to protect their children from corporate poisoning." The silence that followed was pregnant with implications. When Harrison finally spoke again, his voice carried the promise of terrible consequences. "Sergeant Reynolds, you are hereby relieved of duty and ordered to surrender yourself for court-martial. Subject 247 will be returned to reconditioning protocols immediately." "Negative, Colonel," Marcus replied calmly. "We're both resigning from this operation." "You don't have that authority, Sergeant." "Actually, I do." Marcus's voice carried a note of satisfaction that confused Zara until she realized what he meant. "I've been recording everything, Colonel. The environmental damage, the medical evidence of poisoning, the proof that the mining consortium has been committing genocide. All of it has been transmitted to the Galactic Council and the Earth Defense Force Inspector General's office." Another long silence. Then Harrison's voice filled with barely controlled rage. "You've just signed your own death warrant, Reynolds." "Maybe. But I've also signed yours." Marcus smiled grimly. "Corporate-sponsored genocide is a war crime, Colonel. The evidence is already in the hands of people who can't be bought or intimidated." The comm channel went dead, but Marcus didn't seem concerned. He turned to Zara with an expression of peace that she'd never seen before. "It's over," he said simply. "For better or worse, it's over." "What happens now?" Zara asked. "Now we run. There's a resistance network that helps people disappear when the system becomes too corrupt to tolerate. We'll probably spend the rest of our lives as fugitives, but we'll be free." Zara looked at the man who had been assigned to own her, who had instead chosen to liberate her. The man who had sacrificed everything to do what was right, despite the personal cost. "I can live with that," she said, taking his hand. "As long as we're together." 3 months later, they were living on a frontier world at the edge of known space, far from the reach of Earth Defense Force authority. Marcus worked as a wilderness guide for settlers, using his military skills to help families establish safe communities. Zara had opened a small clinic, treating colonists and indigenous aliens alike with her healing abilities. They were happy. It was a simple word for a complex emotion, but there was no other way to describe the contentment they'd found in their new life. They'd chosen each other freely, without coercion or conditioning, and built something real together. The news reached them through underground channels. Colonel Harrison and 3 other senior officers had been arrested for war crimes. The mining, Consortium's operations on Kepler 442b had been shut down, and the planet was being rehabilitated as a protected indigenous preserve. The integration program that had brought them together had been suspended pending investigation. "Do you ever regret it?" Zara asked one evening as they sat watching the sunset over their new home. "Giving up your career, your life, everything you'd worked for?" Marcus pulled her close, his arms strong and warm around her. "Never. What we had before wasn't living, Zara. It was just existing in service to a system that had lost its soul. And what we have now? Now we have each other. We have purpose. We have the freedom to choose who we want to be, rather than having it chosen for us." Marcus kissed the top of her head gently. "I was afraid of being assigned to you at first, afraid I'd become the monster they wanted me to be. And instead, you helped me remember how to be human. Not the human the military wanted, but the human I chose to be." Zara smiled, feeling the truth of his emotions through their empathic bond. They'd both been afraid of being chosen, afraid of losing themselves to someone else's vision of who they should be. Instead, they'd found each other. And in choosing each other freely, they'd discovered something neither the Earth Defense Force nor the Galactic Council had expected. They'd discovered that love was stronger than fear, that choice was more powerful than coercion, and that sometimes the best way to serve humanity was to defy the humans in charge. As the stars came out over their new world, Zara reflected on how wrong she'd been about being chosen by a human soldier. She hadn't been chosen by a monster after all. She'd been chosen by the man she was meant to find.